I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. Before we begin this afternoon's programs, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I am deeply thankful to all the support we've gotten from all of you. You may have heard, those of you who didn't know, that we had a big problem attendant upon the recent financial scandals, and our funding has been severely compromised, so that we let members of the Philoctetes Center that are on our mailing list know about this, and we got an outpouring, amazing outpouring of support, but we need more support. For instance, we have an issue of our journal coming out, which is a fantastic issue. There's a piece by Adele Tutter about Raymond Carver and editing, which is an amazing piece. It took a lot of work, and many other pieces, including roundtables and so forth and so on, and discussions. And we're looking for funding so that we can bring that particular issue of the journal out. We're looking for sponsors for videography. We have a very large number of programs here, including a vibrant research program at Mount Sinai and Rockefeller. And all of these endeavors require support. So if you look on our site and see programs that interest you, come and speak to Ed or I afterwards, and we'll talk to you about it further. The exhibit you see on the wall is related to the show Typography, the roundtable on typography that we did last Saturday, and it's called Typographica. And Hallie Cohn and Adam Ludwig curated this. Elaine Lustig-Cohn and Eleanor Holland, who is a calligrapher, his work is represented here along with Christopher Calderhead. In terms of forthcoming programs, this, I think it's next weekend. Is it the 31st? Not next weekend.
Saturday. Next Saturday.
Next Saturday.
No, the Saturday after.
The Saturday after is a long-awaited roundtable on Spinoza. It's with Rebecca Goldstein and Akil Bigrami and others. And our jazz program continues on the 21st with that one is Dave Levy and Metaphysical Jazz. I had a slip for one moment. Then in the month of February, we have a 6-part series on aggression. It's actually advertised in the current New York Review of Books. You can see all 6 of the roundtables. So we have the psychobiology and politics of war, the psychobiology and politics of genocide, and then 4 other. It's a total of 6, right? And roundtables on aggression. That's also a series that, similar to the series we did on sexuality in the fall, where we try to develop an idea over a series of discussions. So in any case, that's what's coming up. And we look forward to seeing all of you. We're going to be keeping the film program going. Our poetry program is going to be going on. Our classical music program is continuing. All of these programs are continuing now. We're alive, we're well, and we're excited about them. The only thing we lack is the means to do it. So now I am pleased to introduce Susan Jill Levine. Susan Jill Levine is the distinguished... Suzanne, sorry. Suzanne Jill Levine, it's the financial problems. Suzanne Jill Levine is a distinguished translator and innovative Spanish-American writer such as Manuel Puig, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Borges, Cortázar, and she is the author of The Subversive Scribe, Translating Latin American Fiction, and Manuel Puig and the Spider Woman, His Life and Fictions. A professor of Latin American Literature and Translation Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Her honors include PEN American Center and PEN USA West Awards, National Endowment for the Arts and for the Humanities grants, and a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. Suzanne Jill Levine will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, we're all very thankful to the Philoctetes Society for continuing with their programs despite this major setback, and also very happy to see you all here and to discuss this very, one would think esoteric, but obviously not so esoteric topic of the world of the translator. Actually, it was one of the other participants in your programs who actually inspired me, Michael Braziller, to get this program going. And I'm really thrilled to see everybody here and to see such a nice crowd of people. Well, I'd like to begin by introducing my fellow speakers and initiate a few questions that will. I think once we get the conversation going, it will probably flow amongst us. And I really feel that the audience. I know there are a number of translators out there. Please feel free to jump in at any time to ask questions or
Suzanne, one thing I did want to say.
Oh.
On that note, we tend to have the questions after the discussion a little bit.
Sounds good.
If that's okay with you.
Oh, it's fine with me. Yeah, that's
after
fine.
about an
Yeah.
hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, that's cool. So I just don't want them to feel inhibited or restrained or anything like that.
They usually don't.
Oh yeah. They don't look very inhibited, but yeah. Okay, well I'll do this alphabetically and begin with Peter Cole, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. He is a current MacArthur Fellow, which is one of his many prestigious awards and honors. Peter has published 4 books of poetry and is well known for his work on Hebrew literature, especially medieval Hebrew poetry. Amongst his works is a book that is considered untranslatable, the selected poems of Shmuel HaNagid.
It's the translation that's considered untranslatable.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll be part of our discussion then, why you've produced such an untranslatable work there. And he's also, another of his recent books is an anthology that has been praised very highly, The Dream of the Poem, which is a work that reflects Jewish and intellectual life in medieval Spain under Islamic rule. And he is also a publisher. He publishes a press called Ibis Editions in Jerusalem, which recently was praised in the New York Times for its wonderful work in bringing together both Palestinian and Israeli writers. Then there's another Peter right next to him, so I hope you don't confuse the two of them. They're pretty different looking, but there's, their name is confusing. This is Peter Constantine, and he is a fellow in the program of Hellenic Studies at Columbia, and I would say a true polyglot. Peter told me that his native language is German, but he grew up in Greece, and he is again a translator who has received many prizes. Most recently, his translations include anthologies of Greek poetry, Sophocles, Machiavelli. But he's also translated Thomas Mann and Chekhov, and he's written a very interesting book about Japanese slang, I hear. Yes, that sounds very intriguing.
Years ago.
Yes. And next to me, my dear publisher, Jonathan Galassi, who had the faith in me to help me get through that book called Manuel Puig and the Spider Woman. And I think he probably considers I'm a sort of spider woman myself, and I don't blame him. Jonathan, aside from being, well, as you all know, a well-known literary editor, is also a poet and has translated the Italian poet Eugenio Montale. He's currently finishing work of Giacomo Leopardi. Jonathan, who has been a publisher for many years, is now the president of Farrar Straus, and as well as the honorary chairman of the Academy of American Poets. And then we have my dear old friend and brilliant translator, Edith Grossman. Edith, but I call her Edie.
Only in my checkbook.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I'll be, needing it then. Edie is, as you know, a prize-winning translator, both of Latin American and Spanish literature, and her works range from the Golden Age. Her, of course, recent Don Quixote is absolutely magnificent, and she's been working a lot lately in the area of Golden Age poetry. She's working on Gongora, who is really the most probably difficult poet next to your untranslatable work there. But Edie, of course, is known for her translations of contemporary and important Latin American writers, Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, Alvaro Mutis. and many, many others. And of course, she is the recipient of many prestigious honors, including the Pan American Academy and Academy of Arts of Letters. And she was recently awarded the Ralph Manheim Medal for Translation. That's our Edie here. And then we have, last but not least, a novelist who is also a translator, Xiaolong, who is originally from Shanghai and has been a Ford Fellow here at the States since the 1980s, and is the author of 5 best-selling novels in the critically acclaimed, award-winning Inspector Chen series. His books have been translated, of course, into many languages, at least 20. And he also is, as I said, a translator and has translated into Chinese many important writers such as T.S. Eliot, Yeats, and very appropriate to where we are, Freud, among others. So also welcome. Well, there are many ways to begin this program. I do think that what's unique about it, of course, we're going to be dealing with translation from many points of view, but I think that the idea of the world of the translator, of thinking about the figure of the translator, is a very important emphasis here. And just thinking about the Philoctetes Center and what it's about, this whole idea of art as healing, being one of the themes, I guess, of the center. I guess one theme I would like to begin with, I don't know if you all are motivated to do so, but what does motivate us as translators? How do we begin? How do we start? What are the reasons? Are they, psychological, emotional, cultural, aesthetic, political, whatever? I think that might be a nice place to start our conversation. So I don't know.
Well, you can eliminate the financial.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Henry James said that. They're miserably paid, and that's not the reason. So,
Hatred of money.
That's right. That's right. So we don't even,
Hatred.
that's right. So this guy who made off, we wouldn't even have.
He wasn't the translator.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
that's
he
right.
was.
A special kind.
He interpreted
Translated
people's.
money into air.
That's right, exactly. That's called the Magic Act, which, of course, translation is. So I thought that might be some way to start. I actually was watching one of your programs, which I thought was a good idea to do to get the format and stuff, aside from the interest of the programs themselves. And it was the program on autobiography with Judith Thurman and others. And she was saying that how she, as a biographer, she was interested in the writer, and then she became interested in language. And I felt that in some ways my process was the opposite. That I think is my love for language that led me to writers and led me to translation. And when I began, I spent the book I wrote called The Subversive Scribe, which talks about my process of translating a certain group of Latin American writers who became known in the 60s. I begin it with this note, which is rather, I guess, autobiographical, saying that I was born and raised in New York City, which, of course, I'm not used to your weather anymore because I've been living in California, but I was born and raised here, probably unlike a lot of you, in a culture within a culture, in an assimilated Jewish family in which my mother spoke Yiddish to my father when she didn't want me to understand the topic of conversation. And I think that that secret code that was spoken in the house, I think, was part of what stimulated me to want to learn my own secret codes. I obviously was drawn to studying language. French was my first language, and then I fell in love with Spain and the Spanish language. So I think that was what really led me. And I think, maybe the first words I ever uttered were probably in Spanish, because I was about 2 years old and I said, sky, blue. And notice how I put the adjective afterwards, cielo azul. So I was destined to be a Spanish translator before I knew it. But anyway, I do think it was the love of language that brought me into translation and into the love of these writers that I then really felt devoted to. So I don't know, but maybe I should let this conversation flow around to whoever wants to move in that direction. Would you like to begin, Peter?
Well, one thing I think I should probably say is that there are maybe two approaches to what books you might translate. One is a financial question. In other words, if Random House says, we want a new Machiavelli, would you like to do it? Then you either say, no, I don't think so, or yes, please, or whatever your response might be. And I find in the last couple of years, for me, that's become more the case, that I've had less of a choice.
Yes.
And it's becoming harder to actually propose books, which wasn't the case when I started, because the very first book that I translated was 6 stories by Thomas Mann that had been somehow forgotten, that had fallen off the, had been forgotten in Germany pretty much, and were definitely not known here. So when that came out, that caused a little bit of a media frenzy, which took me by surprise. But also that kind of media frenzy and the pleasant prizes from Penn that come with things like that, then also make it easier to suggest books.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you're making. I mean, obviously my first translations were first of Cabrera Infante and then of Manuel Puig, and they were, there were reviews in the New York Times on the first page, and there was a great deal of excitement about the Latin American boom at that moment. It was the late 60s, early 70s, and so that sort of reception and that sort of excitement about literature, about this particular literature that was being discovered, I think was, yes, extremely stimulating to me as a translator, for sure.
Well, it's different than the usual Mario the Magician and Antonio Kroger. And was these different stories in those? Because there'd been a famous vintage edition, I think.
Well, there were stories that started from 1898, I think, when Thomas Mann was very young still, and went till 1906.
So not the classic ones that we saw or we had seen in America here previously.
No, they were nothing like it. But
they weren't in stories from 3 decades.
Oh no, definitely not. Yeah. So Low Porter had not translated those.
Oh.
You're very lucky to have publishers listen to you when you recommend books. I've never had any luck, Jonathan, with that. And I've decided that a recommendation from me is the kiss of death. So the best I could do for a writer I like is to stay very quiet. And hopefully the publisher will find her or him on their own. Publishers will find those writers on their own.
They can't be quite like that, though. I think. I mean, I'm sure they call you and they ask you questions.
You be amazed.
Let's talk later.
I want to hear about it. Well, what was your very first project, Edie? I mean, what was your...
The very first project, I never intended to be a translator, as you probably know. And it was Ronald Christ, who was editor of Review at what was called the Center for Inter-American Relations and is now called the America Society, who asked me to do a translation of a story by Macedonio Fernandez, who was Argentine from the generation prior to Borges. And he apparently was the most eccentric man who ever lived in the northern or southern hemispheres. And he was a very talented and extremely eccentric writer. So Ronald asked me to translate a short story. I'm not even sure if I can call it a story. I'll do what Borges did. I'll call it a fiction, a short fiction by Macedonio. And I said, Ronald, I'm not a translator, I'm a critic. He said, I love Ronald, because he said, you call yourself whatever you want, but I think you might do a good job on this. My confession is that in those days, I smoked a lot. And being able to work at home and not in the library where I had to run out every 45 minutes to have a cigarette was so wonderful that I thought, great, I can smoke myself to death in the privacy of my own home. But it was one of the things that I found wonderfully attractive about translating, was that I could do it at home.
Absolutely.
I don't smoke anymore, thank goodness, but I do love working at home.
But I think one of the things that Edie said that's true is a translator is just someone who decides to do it. I guess there are degrees you can get in it, but it's really it's something that it's an existential decision that you make, that you're going to commit to working with someone else's work. And I think that there's probably a lot of psychoanalytic reasons for that, but there's several different kinds of translators sitting at this table. Some people who do it for a living, whatever you want to say about that, and others who do it avocationally, like me, and maybe, I don't know if you would put yourself in that vocationally, but not remuneratively or whatever. And but we're all doing the same thing. And, the conditions may be different, the time constraints are different, but the actual work is the same. You get right down to it.
I came to, I don't think I ever, like you, I never wanted to be a translator. I had no intention whatsoever being a translator. All through my, let's say, college education and beginning as a poet, I was always discouraged from translating. In the 70s, there were many, I think, sort of the prevalent attitude that I encountered in English departments was to avoid translation. The translation was somehow some kind of debased currency, a sort of watered down, de-eroticized version of English, that it lacked that kind of primal contact. And I had a notion early on that, kind of a Harold Bloomian riff, that my own poetry in English would somehow come out of Hebrew. And that was, like a lot of my notions, fairly delusive, because I didn't know Hebrew. And I grew up more or less like Jill in an assimilated Jewish family. I had some Hebrew day school, but it's, it was just kind of mechanical. But I thought this was something I needed to look into, and I was working in Providence, Rhode Island, after I graduated from college in 1980. And I saw a notice there was some British poet was coming to Brown to give a reading, a guy named Dennis Silk, who Saul Bellow writes about, into Jerusalem and Back. And Dennis is, so I went to there and thought, this would be my sort of key. I'd been reading a lot of Judaica and Near Eastern mythology and all that, but all in English. And in walks this incredibly eccentric-looking guy, sort of, he got a kind of Quasimodo hunch, big bushy eyebrows. And he gave a very good reading. And afterwards, I asked one of those kind of annoying questions, like his early work when he was living in England seemed kind of Yeatsian. And then after 30 years of living in Israel, he had this much kind of more jagged, broken quality, more interesting to me, to his work. And I asked him, not knowing that after 30 years in the country he still barely spoke Hebrew, was it the influence of Hebrew that did this to you, your poetry? And he looked at me and he said, "Do you know Hebrew?" And I said, "No, but I'd like to learn." And then he looked at me again. He said, "How long have you had this problem?" And in a sense, that notion of, not the problem of translation the way people usually talk about it, but translation as this kind of dis-ease, not so much as healing almost, but as this kind of chronic, persistent discomfort that you learn to live with. Before I even got to actually translating other people's works, I was drawn to that for whatever reason. And then it gets even stranger, because I learned Hebrew very quickly, and was thrown right into the Middle Ages and also modern Hebrew. But the first translation that I really attempted was out of friendship, out of that kind of desire. And it was translation of an Israeli poet who actually was born in America, grew up in America, had the beginnings of a career as an American writer. His name is Harold Schimmel, also Bella writes about. studied with, I think Ammons was his sort of sponsor, and he began to write in Hebrew in his late 20s. He moved after, he was in the American Army and then moved to Israel. And I thought he was a marvelous poet. And he couldn't translate himself back into English because psychically it was just too complicated. He would sabotage his own translations in a way. And all American writers and international writers would always come through Jerusalem. And we were, part of a larger literary circle with Yehuda Amichai and all those people. And they would all ask to see this guy's work in English, and it was terrible. And so I began to translate an American poet who wrote in Hebrew back into English. His daughters used to always thank me because they could understand the translation. They could finally understand their father. And something happened in that initial, the pleasure it gave was so intense and so strange, that kind of initial watching what happened, being in the interstices between languages. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, who started out his career as a translator, as a literary translator, has a great quote, a great line from a letter, correspondence with Franz Rosenzweig, who translated the Bible into German with Martin Buber. And Scholem says something about translation being one of the greatest miracles, taking us into the heart of the sacred order from which it springs. And I suppose that's what keeps me, whether it's a commissioned work now or a project I generate, because when you're a poet, you have to generate those top projects yourself. But I also do prose. Even in prose that's commissioned, it's that sense of being taken into the kind of black box of language that provides the deepest pleasure. And even when things get very difficult, of course they always get difficult, that's really, I think, where the where the thrill comes from.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if the Hebrew poets, the Israelis, thought that Schimmel's Hebrew poetry was echt.
Well, it was, strangely enough, his first book was considered a kind of minor masterpiece of idiomatic Hebrew. Because part of it was that he was translating, in a way, things from American poetry, New York school poetry, a kind of talky intimacy that wasn't in Hebrew. And he knew enough, his Hebrew was good enough, so that he could get that in, but he also had the poetics to do it, which they didn't have. But he was very much a poet's poet. And over the years, I think he wasn't completely absorbed into Hebrew. His strangeness is such that he's still very much a poet's poet. But I did a small book of his, and so American poets can read him. And but he's very much, I think, still on the margins.
He was a good friend of Charles Wright in the Army.
I just had dinner with Charles Wright, and after all these years, he's, Peter Cole, because this poet shows up in a lot of Charles Wright's books, as he was a key figure for Wright, and they learned a lot from each other.
You suggest sort of like almost a Borgesian problem, where a poet could live in another language. You could find a language in which a poet could be discovered.
Yeah. Well, that's
not his.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things. It's a bit, I think, a situation you're in a lot. But one of the nice things about living in Jerusalem is that there are so many languages floating around, and shadows and echoes of languages in everything that takes place. And certainly with all the modern Hebrew writers I've worked with, not the contemporary writers, but I've worked with a lot of early 20th century Hebrew writers. They all spoke 6 or 7 languages and read in more. And, so things are coming through their own literature from all sorts of angles. And that's also is a kind of meta-translation. But that also is a source of great richness. For me, I think I translate A to B in that little force field that Scholem talks about. But B, as a poet, for me, it's, while it can also threaten to snuff you out because it just takes so much time, or the other voices can overcome yours, it's really just a tremendous source of nourishment. I just cannot get over sort of my good fortune, the things that translation has brought me. And some of that also comes from, you become interested in one thing, and then you read the person you're translating loved, and that brings you to that. The last thing in the world I ever imagined I would do with my life is translate medieval Hebrew poetry from Spain, and then after that learn Arabic at age 40 or something and translate Palestinian poetry. I don't think I knew what Arabic was when I went to Israel, you know. So the wonder of that's also a great motivating factor.
Yeah, well, as you say, and that's true with Borges, comes up with these very paradoxical stories where he shows how the translator is much more important than the original poet in many cases. I mean, like Edward Fitzgerald as a poet was totally unimportant, but he becomes the poet as a translator, an important poet in the English language because of his translation. And this does bring up an interesting question, which you've already begun to talk about, there are several people here, both poets or writers as well as translators. I mean, which do you think is more difficult, translating or writing your own poetry, and why? You could answer that too, or you as well.
Well, let me first say something about my first project of translation. That was that of T.S. Eliot. And that had little to do with financial consideration. Because you have to do a lot of research on that. And I remember with Chinese translation, Wasteland, the Chinese footnotes much more than the poem itself. So afterward, I talked to the Chinese publisher, saying, I should have translated mystery, something like that. It will bring money much more easily. But that's not the reason, I started the translation T.S. Eliot. Actually, in my case, that's a very ironical reason. For many years, there's hardly any serious literature translation in China. The only writer allowed to be translated happened to be the writers mentioned by Marx, Engels, Lenin. So for instance, Charles Dickens, Shakespeare, and better, the book, the particular novel mentioned by Marx, that's okay. Other than that, nothing. Like modernist writer or modernism was totally unheard of. Like 60, 70, that's Cultural Revolution period. I never heard anything about like modernist literature or T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. So for me, after Cultural Revolution, that was like, a new world opening up to me. But there was ironical reason during that period, because at that time, the government did not really want people to translate modernist literature. But there was a political slogan at that time. China wants to realize full modernization, like modernization of industry, agriculture. So some scholar, not me, played a trick. Say, if you want to realize full modernization, you have to know what modernism is, right? These are the same thing. Yeah, so some government official said, that's okay, yes, we should translate. So whether they understand T.S. Eliot or not, so okay, you do that and I translate that. And also in my case, it's, as you just mentioned, Eliot really becomes so important to me. Many years later, when I got the Ford Foundation Fellowship, I could choose a university. And so I chose Washington University because, it's founded by his grandfather. And he was born in St. Louis. And then I started writing novels. So that's another story. But I kind of felt, I betrayed him. So in one of my novels, I wrote a parody of Love Song Proof Rock. So it's paying my debt, to him. But according to my British publisher, he said, it's not bad. Maybe not as good as Love Song Proof Rock, but it's very close.
A parody is an act of love.
Yes.
That's a wonderful story. But you as a publisher, of course, Jonathan, you're the one who actually holds the purse strings that we're all worrying about or not worrying about. How has your experience been in dealing with translation? I mean, in your long career, and what to you stands out as the greatest challenges?
I think that, I was always interested, since I started doing translation at more or less the same time I started working in publishing. So, and I became enamored of Italy, and when I realized I had a connection to this incredible culture, and that's how I sort of dug into it. And I think Peter was saying something that I feel, which is that when you look at a line of poetry in another language, it has all the secrets and the music and the magic of it are right there in the actual words. And I maintain that you can inhale that and know that even if you don't know a word of what it is, that somehow the nature of the language is right there, and you know right then you'll never be able to do that, because that's what that language is, and our language is something else. So it's the difference, the differential is the dis-ease of translation, but it's also the lovemaking of being a translator. So that all that was rolling around in my mind. But when you actually apply that practically in the world of books, the commercial world of books, it's a very hit or miss process, actually, because it's one thing to translate Unknown Stories by Thomas Mann, which you know that the world needs this book, that this is an unquestionably important exercise and project and act of love and whatever. But when you get into the commerce of current literature, which is where Edith has her problems with me.
Oh, John has no problem.
I think that the real issue, if you've decided you're going to do that, and most publishers don't really decide that, they try to stay away from it. But those who do, the real issue is, how do you know enough to know what really needs to be translated? That's the thing. And it seems to me there are several levels of, let's call it commerce between cultures. There's the commerce of publisher to publisher, where I being a publisher who's trying to sell the translation rights in the books that I've published, want to lay off these books on as many other publishers as I can, for venal reasons, and also for as a John the Evangelist for these, and all that. But I don't know how this work is going to function in the culture it's going into, the reception of it. Just the way. So when I meet an Italian publisher and they told me about all their great new books and this and that, there's really only a very few of those that can connect to our culture in a deep enough way that they can really be received. And I'm talking about immediate. Then there's another kind of translation where you work on things that have already been recognized as essential in one way or another. But that's something that's harder for a publisher like us to do, because we're dealing with the current thing. So it's only when I do think we should be listening to people like Edie, because they know a lot more about the texts and the context of these texts than we can know. But even when it's right, even when it's a masterpiece, blah, 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 most of the time it's not going to find the right people to write about it, like Rachel Donadio writing about the so it's a miracle when it actually does hit, and something like we've had this very big success with the posthumous books of Roberto Bolaño. And actually the translator is someone who used to be an assistant at FSG and who's bilingual, and she's worked with these two.
Mention her name.
Natasha Wimmer, yeah, and she has grown up to become one of the younger, really distinguished Spanish translators, and it's very.
What's interesting about Bolaño, though, is that he wouldn't exist if it weren't for Borges, Cortázar, and those others. They sort of, I think, may set a stage a little bit.
But that's true for literature in general.
Yeah.
It's always built on the back. And New Directions published his other books very faithfully and seriously and well for a good long time. So our success was built on the back of that, too.
I have to disagree with you on something you said. It may be a lunatic misconception on my part, but I don't believe that there is such huge cultural gap. There is such a huge cultural gap that some books are unreadable in other cultures. I really don't believe that.
I'm not saying they're unreadable. I'm saying that they fall on an unprepared ground.
But so do books written in, in the United States, so do books originally written in English.
It's another level of, another barrier.
But is that the financial consideration you're referring to?
Well,
I
didn't even get into that, but there's also the fact that we buy the rights to the book, and then we have to pay the exorbitant fees of these translators.
Hey, $1 every hour.
From your lips to God's ear.
The current translation of War and Peace, for instance, which seems to be a totally different. Or you have Magershak, and you go back to Constance Garnett. You have these generations of these translations. What is your decision? What makes you? Is it that it's generally arcane prose? Is F. Moncrief too? Did you say that? What is the essence of making a decision about a new translation?
The Richard Pevere and Larissa Volkonsky translations of classic Russian literature that they've been doing now for 20 years are, first of all, those are all works in the public domain. So basically they publish their translations as independent literary works. They get paid full royalties, etc. And there's no problem of rights, and and they have a particular brief, which is that they're trying to, I think that Constance Garnett, the most famous translator before them, she tried to make the Russian novels more like English novels in a way, and they're trying to reintroduce the idiosyncrasies of the style of the Russian writers into their translations, and so. And little by little, over time, they have won a big readership. So they're like authors on their own, effectively.
I think,
yeah. And I myself don't like their translation as much as some people do, but I do think they're very distinguished, So, yeah.
I wanted to say something about what Edie and Jonathan said in terms of perceiving, both as a publisher and maybe as a translator, proposing things, what should or could be translated, be brought into English. And we're kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum from FSG. We're a tiny, tiny press, not even in America, as I was telling Jonathan before, not just non-profit, but anti-profit. And we basically work on a volunteer basis, and that ethos is part of it. Is we do it out of love because we know that nobody really cares in a certain sense, And so if we try to make it into a commercial venture, we're just going to be disappointed and become bitter, right? So we should just maintain that kind of low flame. And what we do, we translate work that's written, let's say, in the Eastern Mediterranean and Levant, very loosely defined, basically work that emerges from a kind of cross-fertilization or hybridization of culture, which we also happen to think is an important thing that's being lost in the kind of fundamentalisms of the Middle East. But in particular, we do books that we think commercial or larger presses won't do for whatever reason. For a commercial reason, because they have, that's what they do. They have to keep a business going. Initially, maybe also because we got tired of trying to convince people that X is worth translating and paying for it and all that, and the amount of the time that goes into it. And so one of the factors here is, I think that translators sometimes and publishers together have to make a case or make the space in which a work can be accepted. And grant, the whole economy, that's very complicated to understand. And so this is not an indictment, it's just a comment that we've published several people who no one had ever heard of, or very few people had heard of in English. A Palestinian writer, a classic Hebrew writer, one of them considered untranslatable for many years. And the amount of searching for the right translator to work with this text, and raising the money, and then editing because the stuff was so difficult, and finding the translator that would agree to be edited that heavily and so forth. The whole project took, 6 months for a very small book, a 90-page book. Took at least 6 months to a year. The same translator had translated another book by the same author, and he couldn't get, and is a very famous translator, I won't mention, Nicholas Delange is, if you look up the book that we published, you'll know. He's Amos Oz's principal translator, Yehoshua. He's really one of the more prominent, distinguished prose translators of, let's say, contemporary fiction. And he couldn't get his previous book by the same guy published. Nobody would publish it. And we met him by chance in Cambridge, England. We were talking, and I said, if you've already done that, we would love for you to do this book. You could handle this book. He said, I won't do your book until I can get my other one published. I said, all right, we'll help you get the other book published. It was too big for us to publish. And we looked for a year, and some other small out-of-the-way press published this big novel. And so he turned in, he worked with a partner, he turned in this translation. We worked with them for a long time. Incredibly difficult. Had all kinds of Hebrew scholars and people from the estate chiming in. And it was a book about the 1948 war. So it was really about the most important, sort of tender, painful, vulnerable, relevant thing in the Palestine-Israel conflict. We decided then that we needed to have an afterword, small afterword attached to it to help put it in perspective. We invited a prominent Palestinian writer to do that. He turned in a terrible piece of prose that was wholly inappropriate, and so we had to reject it, which was also politically very dicey, and we found someone else to do it who did something perfect. As soon as that book got published, and we have absolutely no money, boom, it was reviewed in every major paper in England. It was reviewed in the New Republic, the New York Times, sold out very quickly. It was about to be reprinted for the third time. Penguin Classics is just asked to do it. In other words, there was a space there for it, but you sort of had to, there was a kind of imaginative quality in seeing how that little, crack could be translated or turned into a bigger space with a readership. And the problem there is that it just takes a completely uneconomical amount of time to do it, and it relies on philanthropy, essentially. The whole thing is a philanthropic endeavor.
Yeah, well, the translator is a proselytizer and philanthropic in that sense. That's where he's working for someone else as well as himself, for this other person that he's identified with in some way.
Right, and that's part of the pleasure and neurosis of it all, the sort of, that giving out and then resentment, and we all know about it, all that.
It's like writing a biography of someone.
It is sort of, yeah.
Where there's a period where the biographer always hates the subject.
Right. Right.
Yeah, well,
I think
you're always secondary to the...
With medieval literature, I think it's more like writing a novel, because you're creating a fictional character. Nobody knows who that medieval writer is, who you can't really know. It's more like that, but definitely that sort of transference elements are there. I'm curious, since we're in where we are, Do people know about Freud in translation? Is that something that's common knowledge, or what Freud said about translation?
No, what did he say?
It's something I came across just recently, so I'll sound smarter than I am. But
He said dreams are translations.
translation. In his letters to Fleiss, he says that psychoneurosis is brought about by a failure to translate certain materials, and that we fail to translate them. That repression brings about that failure because we are reluctant to enter into the displeasure that the labor of translation brings with it. I thought, I know that feeling.
But you see,
Well, but it's-
I do transference better than anybody else because I fall in love with every writer I've translated. And I know the deepest insight into the natures of those people, beginning with Cervantes and on up. And I have never hated the writer. There have been times when I say, I'm never getting off of page 371. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to translate this page. But always, I've felt such a deep connection to the writer.
Well, I'm not disagreeing. I think is the essential, theory of translation that I work with is just one of sympathy in a very physical, old-fashioned sense. But let's say you happen to find the dead author. It's much easier to love the dead authors, right?
Right.
Who don't talk
You
back
can't
to
answer
you.
back.
Oh, no.
Well,
They
anyway,
can't buy you a glass of wine.
you don't translate Hebrew writers, but they like talking. But I think one of the things I understand that with certain medieval writers, I only love them, but then the difficulty results in a kind of hatred of yourself in a certain sense when you get stuck on page 395 for 6 months or whatever, and it's taking up. You're not up to it. You can't. There are still psychic currents and eddies that are involved in that whole. Even when it's all love, it's not simple.
Well, I would say this, that one thing, that translation is the closest possible reading you can give a text. So sometimes there's a writer who you really think you love, and you start translating,
Right.
and you realize there's something totally wrong with this.
Right.
So that is truly where you find out that you really are in love with the writer or not.
Right.
And
I
if you're,
think that's something T.S. Eliot said.
Yeah.
Love is by nature hatred of yourself. And in my novels, again, it's kind of, just Edith said something about you don't know how readers will perceive the translation or the choice of thing for you to translate. Mm-hmm. In my novels, I initially tried to quote a lot by T.S. Eliot, but that was vetoed by my publisher. She said it's too expensive to quote. And there are
so expensive.
you have to pay.
But I thought isn't it only in the public domain now? No, he's still not. Oh.
It's still there. So there's, I still have the quote, right? So I translate some classical Chinese poets. Now that should be okay. They are 7th century, 8th century, right? No one will claim your rights about that. And it's really to my surprise, when I smuggle all these poems into the novel, and I think my editor was a little bit nervous about that, at first, but the reader's response was quite good. They say they like the poems. I remember in one reading, a reader actually memorized the whole translation. She said, "Oh, I like the translation. I never read that before." So that led to, the translation, the new translation I'm engaged in, translating Chinese poems into English instead of other way around. And so far I did 3 collections. Certainly do not sell as well as mystery books, but they're okay. They're okay, and they are run a few editions already. So yeah, I agree with you. It's sometimes very difficult to tell, right? What readers will really And one excuse I can always give my novels is, in traditional Chinese novel, there is a tradition of having a poem at the beginning of chapter and a poem at the end of chapter. And another excuse I give myself is the current premier. He's premier of China right now. Every speech he would quote. So if he can do that, my inspect can do that, right? So it really started with some excuse, but now it turns out okay. So I'm translating really in addition to writing now.
Well, I was just thinking about how the rules seem to change about how much you can quote and get away with it without having to pay for it. And for example, I know that in Spanish, for example, Manuel Puig, one of the writers I translated, he used lots of quotations from tangos and all these sort of things in his second novel called Boquitas Pintadas, which we called Heartbreak Tango. And I don't think they had to pay a cent, but when it came to translating into English, we couldn't use one song that had been published in the United States because it would have been exorbitant. So we had to find other solutions to that problem because there was no way we could quote.
Oh, I thought there was a fair use, and that
But with
up to certain number
99
of
words, I think, right?
Yeah, only certain. Yeah, a certain number.
99 words.
Yeah.
If it's a 100, then you pay it.
But on song lyrics,
Song lyrics, no.
No, it's even more.
almost nothing.
Actually, my experience with songs and Brecht and many 20th century poems was in a strange book that I did of correspondence between Hannah Arendt and Blücher, where Hannah Arendt would court her very handsome younger husband. I think he was younger actually, but anyway, he was. She thought that he was absolutely wonderful, and a very sexy Hannah Arendt comes out of that. And what she would do is throw Brecht songs at him, but misquote it. Or Nietzsche, she would take Nietzsche, rework him, and throw him at him in a sort of a sexy flourish. And he would try to answer. He too was a philosopher, but not as sharp-tongued and not as sharp-minded as Hannah Arendt. That itself, I must say, also presents some incredible problems because when it's Brecht but not Brecht, or Nietzsche not Nietzsche, then you're being thrown as a translator for a double loop or a triple loop. And still, I must say, translating very difficult authors like Hannah Arendt or Isaac Babel, who was very, very difficult in his word games in Russian, his very strange and crazy, inspired imagery within the language. These things are still a joy to translate, and one has an energy and can manage one's 1,000 words a day or whatever one tries to do. Whereas some other authors who one is told, oh, this is a bestseller, do you want to quickly do him? This author, this best-selling author, maybe finish the book in a month or so and it'll be some quick money for you. Sometimes that actually turns into a much, much harder thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to me there's a serious ethical issue involved, which is that if they threw that novel at you and you said, okay, I'll do a kind of so-so job and translate it quickly, take shortcuts.
I think we can't ever do a so-so job.
Right, so
Right.
therefore it seems to me there has to be a tremendous amount of self-directed ethical principles and values within which you translators work to make sure and struggle to make sure that everything is translated in a way that comes closest to what the writer was trying to say.
One interesting thing I must say about what you said before as well, you really get to know the author, and authors who you've read, who are wonderful authors and famous authors, and I won't say what the name of the authors are, but when you then come to translate them, it is quite shocking how the internal structures of the sentences, how they miss things, and this constant fight that you have as a translator to somehow survive the translation. Yeah, so...
Both of you are bringing up a point that I wanted to raise before, is that there seems to be two types of translations I've seen. One is where someone actually knows the language and does the translation. And the other, you see this with playwrights a lot, where you'll have Eric Bentley or somebody coming along, I'm not sure whether he spoke German, but you had David Mamet doing Chekhov, for instance, and I don't think he speaks Russian.
Right. Well, that also happened, but that's also been very traditional in poetry.
And in poetry.
One of the first projects I was actually asked to do many, many, many years ago was an anthology of Mexican poetry, in which all these famous poets were asking me to do a rough draft, and then they would somehow make a poem out of that.
Exactly.
And it seemed to me that I was very dangerous of them to be doing that, because they have to sort of experience the language themselves in order to really know how to produce the best poem. So, I philosophically find that rather difficult.
Except that what he was just saying, it could be like the poetic translation could be like an objective correlative for the. In other words, you may not catch the exact prosody, but you may be catching something more profound. I'm just posing this when the poet takes on the project.
That's sort of like the classical versus the romantic model, as Borges would put it.
No, I mean, people often that comes up as a possibility, and
You are powerful.
I was being censored. I was about to say something about commercial publishing. I think, anything is possible, right? Miracles happen. Ezra Pound produced incredible things, not really knowing Chinese. But the batting average there is extremely low, right? And the sort of level of presumption, translation is always this kind of balance between presumption and humility, and that's basically almost all presumption. And even people have different tastes, but occasionally great things can come out of that. Certain sensibilities, there's a kind of intuition that leaps across, and the person is the right vehicle. Robert Bly talks about this and his theories of releasing the spirit of the translation from the cage of its original, which seems to me profoundly misguided about the way language works. But sometimes it works.
Ezra Pound's Cathay poems are imitations. They're not translations. Just the way, there was that famous debate about Lowell's imitations, where he really didn't know foreign languages well at all, and he botched a lot of things. But some people thought it was a wonderful new book by Robert Lowell. I don't happen to agree.
But that sort of tangent sometimes catches something essential that a more reliable, faithful, responsible translation doesn't. Gets everything right except for the main thing.
Right.
Yeah, on the other hand, that goes on the assumption, which I think is a false one, that translation is done with tracing paper, that it's a question of doing one-for-one correspondence between two different languages. And there is an artistic sensibility that a good translator has to bring to the text. And sloughing off the work of the translator by saying, well, darling, you just do the rough and I'll take care of it, is so outrageously insulting. One does what one does when one is young, but...
Well, he was a very handsome guy.
And that helps.
No names we mentioned.
As we say in my neighborhood, it couldn't hurt. But there is a literary and an artistic sensibility that has to be brought to the text.
I completely agree, because what you're missing is the contamination, that whole complicated mixing of the sympathy. I know some poets, or one in particular, who said, when he did some project like that, And I said, but you don't speak X. And he said, I speak poetry. And I thought, nonsense, absolutely. But occasionally it works. What can you do? It's
If you hang out with Plato long enough, it works.
That's right. Well, Borges, he's a believer in that kind of thing. Or at least,
But he's Borges then.
right, yeah.
So
Well, I would venture to say there are fewer good writers than good translators.
What?
I meant there are fewer good translators than
Right.
good writers.
No, I think you
That
meant what you said.
was a Freudian slip. It was the right place to do it. Okay.
Well, I think what it amounts to is that most of the things that we say about literature, about original writing, actually also apply to translation and vice versa. We often talk about them as completely different things, but when you press hard enough, often the same thing is going on, just in slightly different ways, or it's a jar. But
Sorry.
No, I just say I've always regarded the work I do in translation as a way of doing poetry. I mean, I try to be very faithful to the text that I'm working with, but it's a way of just another exercise in poetic.
Yeah, Richard Sieber talks about poetry by other means. The line.
You both have mentioned Ezra Pound, like particularly the poem Merchant's Wife, a Letter. I regard this best poem Ezra Pound has written, even though it's a translation. In American Anthology, you can see that's his poem, not as a translation. And it is also a fact he did not really understand Chinese, a few words. I studied that poem. In a sense, you can say it's very loyal, accurate to the image, rather than to maybe an adjective, a noun. So I think that's really come to your question about maybe loyal to the original in a profound way. It's not just like you pay attention to the punctuation, to the maybe a particular article, a particular adjective. Almost all the important important image Ezra Pound kept in English. And of course, he's image poet himself.
Right.
So that's little wonder. Little wonder. So I think that's really very interesting question. Which is really, loyal, truthful to the original, by paying attention to the small thing or paying attention to the most important thing, the sensibility.
Well, but you could argue then you pay attention to the most important thing by paying attention to the small things, right? And I think the thing with Pound that's interesting is, with his whole work with mask, with personae, is that in this case, and Pound had a genius for finding those instances, the adopting the mask of this foreign poet released something in him. Right, he had a kind of psychological genius for conducting those energies, and he also happened to be, have amazing control of English. What happens when a much lesser writer says, "I'm going to put on this mask," and and he just runs around the room making a fool of himself. But it's not just a question of imagery, or it's a question of cathecting or creating certain currents that psychologically work, and you have trusting a certain kind of intuition to make that happen, and that's a talent too.
You could argue that he wasn't as good without that.
Yes, and many people do, and sure. That the other self. I mean, this is one of the go back to your other question about, which is harder, your own writing or translation, or, I mean, I'm somebody who spent a lot of time translating, and there was 10 years between my books of poetry. I just published a new book of poetry, which has the line in it, "It isn't done with tracing paper," because I have a lot of things about translation. And I began, and it was struggling a great deal because I was finding all these other selves so interesting, and, Kenneth Rexroth says about the thing about translations, you keep such nice company. And you get this kind of contact high, and then you're back to the blank page, and that's a whole other story. And the sort of release for me, the persona for me, or mask, came on when I began to treat writing my own poetry as a kind of translation. I was simply translating the world or whatever. Took the pressure off, and then things just began to go much more freely and became much more interesting. And that is sort of the way I guess, at the beginning I was very pure about separating writing from original writing from translation. And now I suppose I've come to a more Borgesian place where it's much more interesting to look at everything as translation.
One thing about your quote there from Fleiss, was it Freud to Fleiss, or is it psychodeurosis?
It is. It's in a very key letter. I forget the year. There's two translations of it. And there's the Letters of Fleiss, and then there's Antoine Berman, who you probably know, the marvelous writer about translation, in a book called The Experience of the Foreign. I think he quotes it in a footnote or something. In his translation, the translations are obscure. You have to work hard at them. But yeah, it's because I feel all those. But I guess the other thing I want to say is I feel translation is an incredibly physical act.
One thing that's interesting about Freud, though, and the whole model of translation and dreams, is that he actually really shows how the process of dreaming is very similar to the process of translating. Dreams, the way they move by displacement, or what you're saying, you don't say what you want to say, but something else. This whole idea of the sort of the metonymic process, as it were, with something associated, and I think that in some ways translation also moves in that way.
Does it?
More
Because
metonym.
I have a hard
You yourself talked about metonym as opposed to metaphor in your piece in Bomb. As a matter of fact.
Well, I translate another contemporary Hebrew poet. I translate a guy named Aaron Shabtai. He's very explosive, now writing political things, but also erotic things. And he happens also to be the greatest translator of Greek drama into Hebrew. He's translated the entire corpus of Greek. Aaron Shabtai, Shabtai. You probably know the brother Yaakov, the novelist who died very young, is considered, after Egnon, the great Hebrew novelist. And his mother was also mother-in-law was one of the most famous psychoanalysts in Israel. And his mother-in-law was his psychoanalyst.
Oh my God.
And
That's every son-in-law's nightmare.
That's incest.
well, there was a certain point, he published it. Yeah. Who counseled him at a certain point to leave her daughter. Yes. No. It was really a crazy situation. Yeah. And marry her, right.
Has Barack Obama heard?
Anyway, when I'm working with this guy on a translation, we were just writing, there was a thing about, we were doing a new translation about the Gaza situation. He writes now very quickly about political things, and Tariq Ali in London had heard about the poem and he wanted to get it for the Guardians. So I was in Denver airport yesterday, flying here, and I guess I picked up my email or something, and I saw he wanted a copy of the poem, and I couldn't send an email out, and so I dictated the new translation, to my wife on the phone, and she typed it in, and she sent it to London. And I thought, this, and just a few days before, I had been going over the translation with Shabtai, and the kind of dance that goes on, we have a very good relationship. We've worked together about 25 years, but in the course of 25 years, there have been, lesser moments, including, fist fights backstage and things like that, or near fist fights. It's almost like I can feel him feeling the psychological complication. He knows how translation is done. He's a great translator. And he respects me a lot, and he gives me my due, and that's all fine. But you're in some space, and it goes to the displacement, where in a way you're kind of trying to push each other. You know that something's not quite right in the translation, but it's not a one-to-one thing. And it's all going on, and you have to know to let it go on, even though, it sounds mystical or just, ridiculous. But that also, I think, is a part of translation, particularly when you're working with an author you know well over time, who's changing and you're changing, and that's also one of the pleasures of it, in a certain sense. And when that works, that's just wonderful. And it goes back to little things, though. It always goes back to little things. That word bothers me. Well, it's not really that word that bothers me. It's the relation between that word and something else. It's always, and then I think it has to do with it. It's never a one-to-one thing. It's always how one thing relates to another, relates to a third. And we tend to talk about it as, particularly in when translation is written about in, the press or literary reviews, often it's word choice, and I just think it's got
It
very little
reminds
to
me
do
of
with it.
John Felsteiner, who wrote about translated Neruda and Ceylon, and he did brilliant work. In one of his books, he says, in the translation of poetry, in poetry, form is everything. And then he says, but in poetry, spirit is everything. And so what you are faced with is not operating in a dualistic way, in breaking what is inseparable into two separate parts.
Yeah.
Which
Not to mention content.
well, yeah.
Because there is a difference. There's three things, right?
Okay.
And, yeah.
So the three,
Yeah.
they are so joined
Right.
in a good piece of writing that you have to try to bring the same sensibility that the original author had, which is these are not separate components.
Right.
These are all a single, they form a single entity.
Right. And this is actually one of the reasons that Arabic has fared so poorly, and particularly older Arabic poetry, because like the medieval Spanish and like some of the work with the Golden Age Spanish poets now too, who come out of it in a certain way, that poetry had always been talked about for a long time as just formalist poetry. And the Arab critics, medieval critics themselves, talk about there's form and then there's content. There's a body and there's clothing. But that's just the way they talk about it. It doesn't mean that that's the way the poets function or compose.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's a
And-
very Aristotelian way to look at
and
things.
the better, newer critics of Arabic literature talk about you can say it's all form or you can say it's all content, but in fact there's no difference, there's no separation between the form and the content, and that is what very few translators, certainly the sort of older Neo-Victorian translations that we know, in a certain sense this is how Fitzgerald is Persian, but it's the same poetics, gets around it. He gets around that problem by seeing it intuitively.
But I have never encountered a Persian who likes the Khayyam translation.
Yeah, I can understand why.
Because it's an English poem.
It's English.
Yeah. There is, for example, a Penguin edition of Khayyam by Avery and somebody else, I forget it. And they do a kind of more literal version, and they give a description of what this poet is like in Persian, which bears no relationship whatsoever to Fitzgerald. But it bears a lot of relationship to medieval Hebrew poets I know, because they're working in the same time, in the same tradition. And the Fitzgerald is that kind of fiction. He himself calls it a fantasia or something, I don't know, or something like that. And to me, it's far more interesting personally for me to go back to take my cues from that physical contact with that original work than it is to traffic sort of in that fantasy. But occasionally I don't speak Spanish, but I just did some more adaptations from a 14th century Spanish poet who also writes in Hebrew, because I know how he thinks in Hebrew, and this is very similar. Santo de Carrion is the early, Machado takes from him the moral proverbs. And I had some in an older book, and I've just done some new ones. And I just got so much pleasure from those things, and and they give a lot of pleasure. And there, I feel like I know this person, very, very well. But I've also done things earlier, Pessoa and things like that, which were total disasters, and I never showed them to anybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, this detail versus the spirit thing may be another way of looking at that, because details are important, but the point of the matter is that you don't translate a text, you translate a context. So it's always, that's what you're translating. So the detail,
And the ethical question you brought up, I think is really critical. It's critical for every kind of translation at every stage, including the sort of reception stage, is taking the translation in. But it's even more acutely critical when you're dealing with, let's say, political things, like I'm dealing with Palestinian or Hebrew writers now, because, what do we want to do as translators? We want to do justice to the originals. Mm-hmm. And what do you do when the thing you're trying to do justice to is, the subject is justice? Mm-hmm. That's, and I think for me that's a really critical thing of, doing justice to the author, to the language, even not even to the author, to the language that's right in front of you.
Aaron Dyckman, this has come up. We had huge fights about this because we have a piece, as I mentioned earlier, coming out in the Philoctetes Journal about the Lish-Carver relationship.
Right.
And so the editing problem is similar to the translation problem.
Right.
Because the question was what was the intention of the author and what was the way in which it was phrased best.
Right. Right.
Oh, I don't really think it's comparable, because no translator becomes an editor in the sense that Gordon Lish was for Raymond Carver. I mean, I have never felt entitled to edit so drastically that I would change a page. I mean, I owe something to the original. I owe a lot to the original and the original.
Edie, but that's you. Some do, though.
Translators who do
Yeah, there are
that.
translations.
Yeah, and you know,
Sure.
there are
With the
texts
writer.
that ought to be treated that way.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other issue. but-
Well, but there's a part of that issue, maybe not the most interesting part of that issue, but the part, so in the Arabic world, most texts are not edited in the Arabic world. Yeah.
But that
So-
editing is a
Is that
very
true?
relatively newfangled invention. I mean, in the 19th century,
Right.
most books were just sent to the press.
Wait, Mahfouz is not edited?
I don't know the specific case, but I would be surprised if he hadn't edited.
There's not much editing, like copy editing,
Right.
done in Spanish.
Right.
Or in
Right.
Greece, or I think actually it's a very different kind of chemistry here in the United States and in Britain,
Yeah.
in the English-speaking world.
And so when you
sometimes
get
the
an indulgent
translations-
writer, sometimes a translator, you talk about seeing the audience or the space for reception. Well, that indulgence doesn't translate very well, and so in a sense, the translator has to come in. I mean, if I do it, it's only with permission of the author. But I do know,
Authors,
as an
must say,
editor, I know other
can be
translators.
very difficult, though.
What's
And
that?
I was going to ask you. You seem to have a very good relationship with your poets, and I will
The one I'm
admit.
still speaking with.
Oh, okay. 'Cause I will admit that I'm a bit too timid, I think, to usually speak with or to.
But Jonathan can talk about
or-
that. Yeah.
Maybe it's not timidity, but there's a sort of I prefer a wall between myself and the author because the personal view or the subjective view that the author obviously has can get in the way of the objective, and if the author begins to control what you're doing, you can
That's
be
a
in trouble.
different thing. I'm talking more about what Jill said, of displacement. Several of the Hebrew writers I translate, even the Palestinian, their English is pretty good. They could give me a trot if they want, and sometimes Shabtai, for example, will get very pushy into here. It's not such a hard poem to translate. Here's what it says. You just, make it into good English. And I get, do not show me your trot. I do not want to be infected by that thing of yours.
Yeah.
But I want to hear his voice. That's the thing. I want to get something from him talking about the situation, and then I'll take it from there.
I think Peter Constantine said something that's really very true about the cultural values that are involved in translation. The fact is, we're in the Anglo world, we're used to a more tailored text. That's what you're saying. And a lot of other cultures, that's not what's going on. So it's an interesting question. Should we be, we think that these texts could benefit from tailoring. I just said it myself. But, that's a kind of, there's an imperialist value in that, the idea that we know best about how the text should be,
I mean, the editors as imperialist.
Yeah, it's sort of a, there is sloppiness in texts that aren't copy edited, where repetitions or inconsistencies or errors.
It's all fixed up when they copy edit the translation.
Well,
I'll never forget, it was in one of Garcia Marquez's books, and he was talking about the popes, and he said between this year and that year, there were 5 popes. And a copy editor said, oh no, there were 4. I said, I can't change that. You have to talk to him. It's not my province to change that. And maybe he wanted to have the mistake, like Cervantes' arithmetical error in Don Quixote. So I I got in touch with Garcia Marquez. I said, listen, this woman thinks that there were 4 popes, and she's listed the date. And his answer basically was, whatever.
Well, that's exactly my point.
Well, he wasn't writing history. He was writing
I just translated
There were a lot of popes that year.
I just did a book of prose for New Directions, a short novel by Yoel Hoffman, and he's a kind of zany, quirky writer, and he has at a certain point he says, and when I was visiting Maryport, which is on the northwest coast of England, such and such and such happened. And so as a diligent translator, I checked. Now it's Google, it's easy. Check. Maryport's on the northeast coast of England. So I make a little note to query him. 2 sections later it says, the scrupulous reader will have noted that Maryport...
That's why it's good to read the whole book before you translate it. Well, it's
That's
not
actually
necessary.
a question. Do you do that?
No.
And you do that.
I think at this point, we should open this up, though, to our very delightful and patient public. I'm sure there are questions, and there are other issues that we could bring up, but does anybody have a question? Or
They walked through the...
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
My question has to do with computers. Do you think that poetry or novels will ever be able to be translated by a computer? I think the answer is no, but I'd like to hear your answer, and if it's no, why not?
Okay.
Oh, I can answer that.
Excuse me.
No. And the reason is that the computer program is only as good as the programmer.
That's right.
And no programmer can predict ahead of time the linguistic and contextual problems that a text will present. So I think you need an active, sentient human being responding to the text rather than a machine.
Well, you can do it on Google. You know, you can have text translated, and you see what you get. You know,
I think you should not mention these things, John.
I have an Italian friend who wrote to me, and we always spoke French together, but for some reason he decided, since he's been back in Italy for a long time, he should write to me in English, so I understand. So he writes to me in English, and the Côte d'Azur, which is Côte d'Azur, was translated into the Blue Coast by one of these translations.
Well, it can get a lot worse than that.
Yeah, certainly can. Go ahead. Yes.
I was touched by your remark about loving getting into the space of love out of which your poet that you're translating was in. And I think you have to some extent, get into the soul of the person, the soul of the language, the soul of the culture, even the soul of the civilization, depending on how ancient the work is. Otherwise, form and content just lose it. You need the 3 aspects. And there are just 2 one-liners that I'd like to share with you from translations of the poet Rumi, the medieval Persian poet. One is, "Oh, break the glass and draw nearer to the breath of the glass blower." And the other is, "Oh, savor the nectar that's been poured for you. Don't mind that it's served in an imperfect cup."
Thank you.
You all were talking around the question, I think, of the ethics of editing in translation, but I don't think I heard a specific answer to the following situation. You are editing, say, a work by a poet whom you admire, but even poets that you love can have certain infelicities in their phrasing, and you come across something, maybe not a poet, maybe a writer of prose. So, an infelicity of phrasing, you don't think it's deliberately infelicitous, you just think it's bad. do you, as a translator, undertake to improve it, or do you feel you have an obligation in the translation to have the reader in another language be aware this wasn't actually so good?
I mean, I don't find that actually, if the writer is alive, if I have a good relationship with him or her, that's not, I don't find that would be a problem. I will simply say exactly what you said, and then say, if we have a relationship that's developed already, we'll talk about it. And most of the writers I deal with, particularly the ones who are themselves translators, they understand that things, morph and they change in the process, and they'll say, well, okay, yes, thank you, go ahead, change it. Most of the time. And sometimes they'll say, well, my gut tells me that it's better to leave it that way, but I leave it to you. But usually that's not the source of problem.
No.
That kind of thing is a fairly straightforward situation if there's a dialogue.
One problem that I think we sometimes run in from Spanish to English is, for example, the way races are referred to. I mean, there seems to be much more sort of like, it's curious, it's sort of like a different attitude toward racism in Spanish, and when it comes out in English, it seems very brutal. And that's
the one that gets me, that I really have censored myself on, that is the piel roja, which is redskin.
Right.
And I have told writers, I cannot use that term. It is so insulting, and it is so racist that I am simply going to have to do something else and use Indian, which isn't the best word of all, but if you go into Native American in a Latin American novel, it doesn't work. But I have
African American.
I mean, writing redskin is something I cannot do. I was asked to translate a short novel of Cervantes that has a paragraph of anti-Islamic propaganda that I found so horrifying that I told the editor I can't translate it. I'll be damned if I censor it, but I absolutely cannot be involved in the translation of this piece. Maybe in 100 years, when it all settles down, somebody will be able to read a 17th century text and read these scurrilous attacks on Islam and say, it's okay, it's a product of its time, but I couldn't do it.
How did you indicate that it was left out, or you just?
I didn't translate the piece. I turned down.
So you turned down the project.
I turned it down. I said I can't do that because I couldn't possibly omit it.
Right.
But I couldn't possibly translate it.
What if that's in the mouth of a character?
Well, things that are in the mouths of characters are different because those, I don't have a problem with that. It's the narrative voice using that kind of language that I find difficult because the narrative voice has a certain authority. And to give authority to racist remarks, I find intolerable. If the character is racist, that is a function of the character.
Why can't you add a note? There are many times for the translator to intervene. We try to keep it to a minimum, but why can't
you come up to the microphone because we're actually recording this whole thing.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
I'm sure you have something
That
to
wasn't
say.
that wasn't the most interesting thing I had to say.
Well, we'll just do a footnote on it then.
I'll suppress all the other things. No, as translators, we could write all of us write memoirs of interesting experiences and anecdotes. I had one for Leon Friedman, who's the lawyer for the Pen Club, but I think he's gone. A question about something. But anyway, about this, I don't see why. I think I would always go ahead, although I'm somebody who turned down the translation of Ragazzi di Vita by Pasolini when it was offered to me by Jonathan Cape way, way, way back, because it was entirely in Roman slang and completely. I could have handled the pornographic side of it. I wasn't sure at that point I could handle the linguistic side, and maybe I was just lazy. But I think it's all right to have notes from the translator. I never mind. Maybe some people do. Perhaps the publishers don't want it too much. But it would have been an interesting point for you to intervene there and to say, today we are shocked, in the back of the book, today we are shocked by such an attitude, but you have to remember there were the Crusades, whatever you want to do. No, just...
I don't agree with you about
I don't
the
think you
footnote.
have to leave your personality out entirely. And I say that as a translator of Gramsci, was the founder of the Italian Communist Party. You do have a chance either in your introduction, if they will allow you an introduction, and they should, if you have something interesting to say. I think we should be brave and adventurous and not be too politically correct. I don't think we should be politically correct as translators or even as writers, and I think it all can be annotated. It all can be,
Listen,
it can be tempered.
I'm sorry I didn't talk to you before I turned down the job.
No, we don't.
We need more people like you.
Wonderful solution. And if it ever comes up again, I'll remember.
Well, let's be in touch. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Lynn Launer. Okay, that's enough for me.
Peter Cole, could you say a little more about, you said writing is, translating is a very physical process, but then the conversation got away from you.
Well, it's sort of like what Edie was talking about in terms of sympathy, but for me, or somebody said something quoting the Rumi, the access to that spirit for me comes through the physicality of the letters and the words and the way all these things come together. And so, it's also the case for prose, at least certain kinds of prose, but prose has rhythms and shape, and it's the same, really. The process of receiving, of listening, translation is a process of listening, and of taking the poem in for me is actually the most critical stage. I mean, there's a time that doesn't take the most time, but if I take a short, or am lazy in my listening or attending to the poem, then the work's going to be much more difficult. Whereas if somehow I'm able to absorb a poem, it doesn't mean I get it all the first time, obviously you don't, but if I get some kind of essential, strong, intuitive sense of the work, it's as if a tone, like with the tuning fork, a tone has been struck. Ah, that's what it is. Now I have to work to strike a similar kind of or equivalent tone in English. But I have that in mind so I know when it's done. Otherwise, I'm just groping all around. And so I feel that it is a combination of listening to, and listening is a physical thing. I mean, I feel words in a kind of choreographic and aesthetic sense. Listening to that original language, the shape it makes, its speed, its weight, its feel, and then trying to work something similar up in English, and then listening to the English and feeling the English that's in front of me. And I don't really know what else to say, except for that takes place much more in my body than it does in my mind. And I literally, when I read good translation by other people, my body feels good. When I read bad translation, it's upsetting.
I mean, in a sense, translation is a performance.
Yeah,
So it's like, it's
definitely.
almost like performance. And, it's like Flaubert speaks about how the sentence is the unit of rhythm, that you sort of look at the sentence as a whole. And I think also when we translate, ultimately you're not going, even though you have all the words in your head, you are thinking about the movement of that sentence, and you're trying to somehow,
Right, and you should get
I
pleasure.
sometimes translate out loud when for problematic parts.
Right.
Because your eye forgives everything and
Oh,
your
yeah.
ear forgives
With poetry, I translate everything out loud at some
it's
stage.
very important to get the real sound of the language
That's
in
what
your
was-
mouth
yeah.
and in your ear.
Yeah, and, well, that's the thing, is in your mouth. This goes back to that original issue of, does translation provide that same kind of erotic pleasure that an original, and the people who are against translation or for translatories or whatever say no, and I say no, that's what the translator has to do, is create that experience in the mouth. Yeah. It was interesting with the whole thing with Shabtai dictating this poem over the phone, because that was like, that's a real good test. I thought when I was done, I said, that's a real good test for a translation, dictated over the phone as if it were breaking news, and see if it's worth transmitting. So,
I wanted to ask the two of you who seem to make some connection between translating and Freud, and see what exactly you had in mind.
We're both Jewish.
and that's the extent of it. Right?
That's the time. The kind of translation Freud was doing is, in fact, changing it into something completely different.
Yes.
So if you had Dora playing with her little pendant, and Freud made an interpretation or a translation of that representing sexual desire, that wouldn't be what a translator would get involved in, I assume. And the same is true with dreams.
This is the dangers of dilettantism, but because we don't really know much about
Speak
Freud.
for yourself.
But you are into, again, kind of Borgesian category of degrees of difference. And if we start out by saying, as almost everybody says, including most poets, I'm on lots of translation panels, and almost the first thing everyone says, translation is impossible. So if it's impossible, then what you have is different, right? It's going to be completely, essentially different. I mean, I don't think it's essentially different. It's just much further away. So in this Freudian case, it's much further away. And Borges writes very well about this kind of differences of kind and degree in translation. Are they all translation, or do we have to, at a certain point, do we have to give it another name? I think I used to give it another name, and now I don't give it another name.
Well, I mean,
what was the other name?
Well, adaptation, imitation. I mean, there are all these, transcription. The best one I know is poet Basil Ponting. He calls his translation overdrafts. Overdrafts.
Yeah, I mean, Borges basically says everything is translation, in a way. And I mean, when you think of it,
But then he goes into detail.
And then he goes into, well, that's true.
Well, there are two kinds of overdrafts. There's writing over, like tracing paper, and then there's
the bank. Well, that's what he means in part, is that he's in dad maybe a little beyond his depth there. So, yeah.
Well, we have learned a lot here about a very unusual process that takes place before this book gets into the reader's hand. We have one artist who is the original person who's conceived this, a publisher publishing in one language. Fortunately, it comes to another publisher who seeks out someone with talent and soul and smarts. And we know how hard it is, how you're working through all the words, the lines, your conscience, the soul. I was just reading an article in PW. It was an interview of Natasha Wimmer, and I was upset by the last line. After all, this big do about the Savage Detectives and 2006 and the glory of the reviews, she can't make a living, she says, even though she's trying and it's getting better. But the last line said, she still doesn't know why the publishers do not want the audience to know that the work has been translated. I would like some kind of information from somebody. I guess you are the authority, so we can start that way. But it really bothered me a lot. Is that true?
Well, it is true, and but as a translator, I'm a proponent of that the translator be considered as an author as well. But the reason for that is that traditionally, salespeople feel that a book that says it's translated on the cover is going to have a harder time in a bookstore, and it's true, but nevertheless, it needs to happen.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
The reader.
Because most readers are very diffident people who don't venture very far out of their own zone of comfort. That's why.
Being translated in Europe.
Well, there's a weird thing about the English language, and I can only say this, but I give no explanation for it. And that is that in the US and the UK, only 2 to 3% of books published each year are translations. When you go to Latin America or Western Europe, the percentage zooms up to 35, 40, 45%. So there is some Anglo language resistance.
There's a reason, for a historical reason, is that European countries rub up against each other. Europeans, most of them have to know more than one language because their relatives live across the border, or England is an island, and America was an even bigger island, and that it's a fact of its cultural history. That's the reason. I'm not saying it's right. It's not right.
There has to be more, because a person living in Paris these days or in Brussels is fluent in English and does not speak a word of Italian or Spanish necessarily. So there has to be more
English
about.
has become the lingua franca of the Western world, or the
also
world.
a state of mind, though. I think a Greek public will rush to buy a foreign book, not necessarily English, but very interested to know what's going on in Germany or in Czech Republic or in Albania, which happens, I think, throughout Europe, also in Russia, and in general, there is an interest of what's happening beyond the borders. And we're told in Europe that in America they're always very surprised, the foreign rights people in German publishers, why they cannot. Why they have major books, why there are major authors who have been translated into Hindi, into Bengali, into Tagalog, but not into English. And English is often the very, very last step before, when you are arrivé, you are then finally, as an
international. The man who just won the Nobel Prize, I think, had one story translated into English.
No, he's had books published.
Oh, let me say that, Jonathan. Don't mess up a good story.
It's also a fact of cultural imperialism.
Yes, it is.
Going back to the British Empire.
Absolutely.
And then the American
That's a
Empire.
very important part of it.
That the English language has dominated the world for the last 150 years. And that's part of it. And Americans are very insular. They are. They just, you see Americans in Europe that look like they're walking through a diorama with their sweatpants on and their, it's not real to them.
The major paper in Israel, Haaretz, in their weekend culture section, they'll often, pretty much every month, they'll give like a half a page of a newspaper to, 6 translations of an Emily Dickinson poem. This is a daily paper, and if there's a new translation of Plato or something, they'll have 2 or 3 reviews of it. In other words, it has to do with the state of mind and this taking pleasure in all that possibility, rather than, whereas I think the sort of default position in English is impossibility.
And I think one of the results of that is that I've heard that I'm probably one of the only people in America who just translate and do nothing else. I'm a literary translation. I think I've been told that that's the case, but I think he stopped. And I think it was the 2 of us who were doing it.
And
nothing else, right? Oh, good.
That's why I give Jonathan such a hard time.
So it's I think one can count us on one hand, or I hope it's 2 hands, but it is something that is not the case in smaller European countries where there's a constant flow of work, and what happens is that we have to adapt maybe, and also what is out there instead of maybe just presenting and doing it as an act of love or an act of admiration for the author.
My intervention is inspired by the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, early 19th century theologian, who wrote brilliantly about translation and said that one of the things that translators do is educate the people of their nation about foreign cultures and becoming open to foreign culture. So in that spirit, I have a modest proposal, Jonathan. Just say it was hypothetically possible to convince all the major publishing houses in the United States for 1 year to publish only translations.
Oh my God.
How long do you think it would take to change the reading habits of our country?
Either that or they go bankrupt.
They already are.
I think that that's a very radical idea. That's a dream, a Freudian dream of a translation of what, I don't know. But
a little Newport overstitious.
I think that the world is getting smaller all the time. I think that we've found, until the recent crisis, that things were easier with translation, and the fact is that we've sold 100,000 copies of 2666, and that means that it's not just a specialized thing, but it reached into public consciousness in a major way. But the reading public for literary works, we're talking about the top 3% of our culture too. I think that. We have to be realistic about that, and be glad that we have people like Peter and Edie and Jill and Peter Cole and you, sir, to bring things into our consciousness. But this is a very big, diverse, rough country, and we're not going to transform it by just publishing translations, I don't think.
I have to tell you what Philip Roth said, which I'm sure you all know. Some years ago he said, there are 4,000 readers in the United States. And once you have sold them and the libraries, you're finished. And it's a startling and discouraging idea. So I think he picked 4,000 out of the air, but he's saying what you just said, that the number of people who read novels and poetry is very small.
And they're getting there's more competition for their time now all the time. So now we have a translator here.
Yes, we have a translator, poet, and of all things Swedish, and who has actually had to defend Horace Engdahl, who most people don't know has now stepped down as permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy.
Because of what he said?
No, not because of what he said, because Horace Engdahl is multilingual and brilliant, and when he started, he kind of said, I think I'm going to give this 10 years, and the 10 years are up, and he will remain permanent secretary until June, and then someone by the last time, I think his name is Englander, he's a historian, and he will become permanent secretary. But I just, I've been doing this kind of thing, translating mainly poetry, because I think when I first translated, you weren't at Farrar Straus then, but when I first translated Hesse for Farrar Straus, I think I got $25 per 1,000 words. But first, actually, I translated a book of Hesse's poetry for Farrar Straus, and because James Wright had done a book beforehand, I actually got paid well. Everyone told me I was being paid well for poetry. And then, one thought, well, maybe when you translate prose, you get paid decently. That just wasn't the case. At any rate, I've heard, I used to translate from German mostly, and now I translate, I guess I've done more Hesse, but not for Farrar Straus, because the 20-book contract finally got fulfilled with Surkamp. And certain things end up in the public domain, even though in certain ways they're not, but they were published during different political times. And things fall in and out of the public domain in different countries at different times. And the world is extremely complicated. And so should be publication in this country by all parties. And even Farrar Straus is no longer, a United States company. And that's why it's part of a conglomerate. So I don't want to dump on Jonathan, but it's very difficult for everyone at all times. It's particularly difficult now, but that's no reason to use the old arguments. I have been translating from German or Swedish since 1974. And I've heard the same things all of the time, especially for so-called minority languages that have never had a boom in this country, the way Latin American languages have had. So that I think Susan Bernofsky's idea of having, and I don't think they could publish only translations, but if they could each commit to publishing 5 translations, it would be a huge up in the number of translations published in this country. So if we could have a truly modest proposal, it would be fantastic. And I also wanted to say with Peter Cole, I have a relationship with a Swedish poet I've been translating for 25 years that is so much like yours with our own. And also that if I have asked him to read, we have a kind of bilingual relationship that isn't the same, but if I need to hear something, it's to hear him read the poems in Swedish only, and then shut up, please. Yeah. So thank you.
Do you remember the days when you got paid 50 cents a line for poetry? And that meant if you translated a sonnet, $7.
That's right.
$7.
You got $14 for the New Yorker. What's the difference?
Yeah.
For Betrayed by Rita Hayworth, I got $15 per 1,000 words.
Isn't that extraordinary?
Do we have another? No.
Yes.
Someone was talking about the English being spoken, learned everywhere, and you have the market there, and the publication in English has a potential of being bought abroad now, much more than before, and I think if you translate, for example, Chinese poetry, then some Chinese will want to read it, and also Japanese may want to read it. Sometimes it's interesting to read the translation more than the original, and it's a good learning experience. I read a book of translated Japanese poems by Ishikawa Takuboku by Carl Caesar. Yeah, and that really taught me how to read Ishikawa Takuboku in a different way. And so I think if you try to translate and publish and then try to sell it to the countries of origin or countries around there, you may have a surprisingly large readership, more than 4,000.
That's an interesting.
I'd just like to express my appreciation to the author of the Inspector Chen novels, which are fabulous. I haven't seen one recently. I don't know whether I've missed a publication of one or more, but I look forward to reading more of them, and I commend them all to you all. They're fascinating, and I don't believe the literature that was handed out today indicates that Inspector Chen, the main character, is himself a translator. And that's
an excuse. He can, quote poems.
Yes. He's an inspector, a police inspector, detective, a translator, and a poet. All in the context of contemporary Chinese society. and they're fascinating, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to express my appreciation to you directly. Thank you.
Thank you. The newest one is coming out next month. So I can tell you that.
First of all, I want to thank everyone. I found the discussion very engaging. And but my particular question is for Mr. Chiu. And I was going to ask him, I think translation, as we'll discuss, is a very difficult and involved process, no matter which languages you're translating from or to. But in Chinese in particular, and especially classical Chinese, if you're translating poetry, you might have to translate one line of 5 syllables. And to take all the meaning that that encompasses and put it into English, not only is there difficulty in translating the meaning, but the entire sound of the sentence is completely different. Like when you go from 5 syllables in Chinese to maybe, I don't know, like 10, 15 syllables in English, I don't even begin to understand how you can replicate it. If you could shed some light on your process, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a very specific question and also a very good question. You're talking about a certain Chinese form, like like a poem can be 4 lines. Each line consists of only 5 characters. So in other words, the whole poem can be only 20 characters, no more than that. It's extremely difficult. So when I deal with poems like that, sometimes I have to tell myself, like, something I cannot do, something I can do. Like with this kind of poem, image, meaning, I try to recapture them in English language. But in terms like, I tried, like in my earlier draft, I tried to use maybe 5-beat, iambic, try to be correspondent to the 5 character in the Chinese. But usually the Chinese language, the meaning can be even more suggestive. So 5 feet really cannot do the job. So at this stage, I'm still trying to explore the possibility. At this stage, what I do is usually I tell myself what I can do and what I cannot do. Like I cannot try to imitate each line consisting only like 5 character or 5 feet in English. That part I have not been able to do. But like the image, the meaning, and the suggestiveness of the poem, I try to do that.
Well, I guess.
I said one following thought of writing. Is Chinese obviously the language that you write the Inspector Chen novels in?
No, I write in English.
You write it?
I write in, yeah. But originally, yes, it's really more like half translation, half writing in English.
So you're like Conrad, sort of.
Yeah, I actually translated one story by Conrad, Secret Share.
Okay. That's great.
Thank you.
About our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.